The night Spencer Holloway broke my father's chess piece and told my 8-year-old grandson to stop crying over toys. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up from the table. I did not tell that man a single word about who I used to be or what I was still capable of doing. I folded my hands in my lap, looked at my grandson's face, and went completely quiet. But quiet is not the same as still. And patience, when it has been trained over 31 years, does not look like helplessness. Before the next morning was over, Spencer Holloway would understand that I want to tell this story the right way, which means starting where it actually started. Not at that dinner table, not at the moment the chess piece broke, but years earlier, when my daughter first started checking her husband's face before she finished her own sentences. My name is Edmund Caro. I am 68 years old. I am a widower, a retired federal employee, and a grandfather. For most of my adult life, I have lived quietly in a small ranch house in Westport, Connecticut. The kind of house where neighbors still wave from their driveways, where the hardware store knows what paint color your shutters are, where nothing extraordinary is supposed to happen. My wife, Helen, died 3 years ago from a cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. We had 39 years together, and I will not pretend the last 3 without her have been anything other than what they were. Hard. Quiet in the way places get when the person who made them feel like home is gone. After Helen died, my daughter Caroline and my grandson Sam became the only family I had left. That matters. Not as a preamble. As the whole point. Caroline was 41 when this story began. She had married Garrick Holloway 7 years before, when she was still the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it warmer. Quick-minded. Warm. Funny in that dry, patient way Helen had been funny. When Caroline was young, she used to argue with me at the dinner table about things she had read. Not to be difficult, but because she actually cared about being right. I loved that about her. Helen used to say, "That girl is going to either change the world or exhaust it." Garrick changed her. Not all at once. Never all at once with men like him. It is always gradual. A correction here. A long silence there. A smile at a dinner party that made her feel suddenly uncertain about a story she had been telling confidently 2 seconds before. By the time I noticed the pattern, it had already become her normal. Garrick was 36. He ran a private equity firm in Stamford called Holloway Bridge Partners. And he treated money like a language he had invented and everyone else was still learning to pronounce. He was good-looking in a cold, architectural way. Always dressed precisely. Always certain. Always standing slightly ahead of whatever room he was in. The first time I met him, before he and Caroline were even engaged, he asked what kind of return I was getting on my retirement savings. When I mentioned my federal pension and my credit union savings account, he smiled like a man who had just confirmed a suspicion. That smile told me everything I needed to know about how he saw me. What Garrick did not know, and never thought to ask, was that for 31 years at the United States Treasury Department, my job had been to follow money through places powerful men believed no one would ever look. I had tracked shell companies through 14 countries. I had sat in rooms with people who believed their last name and their tax attorney made them untouchable. I had learned to read a man's financial behavior the way a doctor reads a scan. Not for drama, for truth. I had kept all of that quiet, not out of false modesty, because in my line of work, the most useful thing you could be was the person no one worried about. I was very good at being that person. Sam was 8 when this story reached its turning point. He was small for his age, serious-eyed, with the kind of mind that was always working a few steps behind his face. He liked chess, old maps, and asking questions that sounded simple until you realized he had been sitting with them for 3 days. He reminded me of Helen in the way that mattered most. He paid attention when adults assumed he was not listening. He was always listening. He had a habit of carrying books against his chest like armor. After weekends at his father's house, there was a particular way he walked in from the car that I noticed. Head slightly down, shoulders pulled forward. The posture of a child who had learned to make himself smaller in rooms where he was not sure of the rules. Helen would have recognized it immediately. She always said quiet children were not empty. They were full of things they had not yet decided how to say. After Helen died, Caroline began inviting me to Sunday dinners at the Greenwich house. At first, I was simply grateful. I told myself she wanted to keep me close. I told myself the distance I felt at those dinners was just my own grief, making everything feel slightly off. But grief does not explain why your daughter pauses before answering a simple question. Grief does not explain why a grown woman checks her husband's face before finishing a sentence she started on her own. The Greenwich house was large enough to contain an entire silence inside it. 4 offices, each with a locked door. A dining room built for impressions. Windows so tall they made you feel small, regardless of where you stood. Garrick's cars were always new. His suits were always correct. And the whole house had that particular kind of order that is not about comfort. It is about control. I would drive 45 minutes up, I-95. Park behind whatever Garrick had bought most recently. And carry whatever dish I had made into a kitchen that smelled like someone else's choices. Garrick usually acknowledged my arrival with a nod and went back to his phone. He was never rude in any way you could pin directly. He was simply absent. The kind of absent that makes you wonder if your presence has any weight at all. And Caroline cooked. And poured wine for people who ignored her opinions. And smiled at jokes that landed at her expense. And I watched all of it and told myself that plenty of marriages were imperfect. That plenty of women made compromises. That I did not know the full picture. I was telling myself a comfortable lie. The dinner that ended all of that happened on a Sunday in late October. Caroline had called me 3 times to confirm I was coming, which told me more than the calls themselves. Helen used to say Caroline only asked twice when she truly needed something. 3 times meant she was worried. The reason became clear when Spencer and Vivian Holloway arrived before I did. Spencer was 72 but moved through the world like a man who considered aging optional. He wore a navy blazer with brass buttons, had his silver hair swept back with the kind of precision that takes real effort to make look effortless, and wore a watch on his wrist that likely cost more than my car, my roof, and my furnace combined. He had the practiced ease of a man who had never in his life stood in a room where he was not the most important person present. I held out the wine I had bought. $38. The most I had ever spent on a single bottle. I had stood in that shop for 10 minutes reading labels I barely understood, trying to choose something that would not embarrass Caroline at her own table. Spencer took it, glanced at the label for half a second, and set it on the console table beside a framed photograph of himself shaking hands with a senator. He did not say thank you. Edmund, he said. Not a greeting. A confirmation. Like checking a delivery address. Vivian hugged me with the shape of warmth and none of the heat. Across the living room, Sam was quietly dribbling a soccer ball between 2 chairs. The soft thump of it, the only child-sized sound in that adult room. Spencer looked at him once. Boys playing inside. He said, "That's how things get broken." Sam picked up the ball and held it against his chest. At the time, I told myself it was just the way older men spoke. A generation's bluntness. I told myself too many things that night. For too long. Before I stopped, dinner was served at 7. The table sat 6 people, but felt like a boardroom. Spencer arranged himself at the head with the ease of a man who considered it his by right. Even in his son's house. Garrick let him. That small exchange told me a great deal about how long this dynamic had been running. For the first part of the meal, Spencer managed the room the way he clearly always did. He moved from real estate to golf memberships, to charity boards, to the names of people whose primary value was how they sounded in conversation. He did not ask Caroline about her work. He did not ask Sam anything at all. Then Sam reached for the breadbasket. He was polite about it. He said, "Please." He had been raised to say please. Spencer set down his fork and looked at the boy with an expression I have seen on certain men's faces all my life. The expression of someone who has decided this moment belongs to him. "Is that how we ask?" Spencer said. Sam said please again. Clearly, the magic word didn't sound very magical. Son, try again. Sam said it again. Then again. His voice got smaller each time. His ears turned red. He was 8 years old, asking for bread at his own family's dinner table. And a man he barely knew was making him audition for it. Caroline laughed. A short, thin, horrified laugh that she immediately swallowed. Garrick stared at his phone. I set down my fork. From the outside, nothing changed. I did not push back my chair. I did not look at Spencer. I simply placed my fork beside my plate, folded my hands once, and looked at my grandson's face. But inside me, something very old and very trained woke up. I had spent 31 years learning to read a room before the room registered me. I had learned which silences were fear and which were strategy. I had sat across from men who moved money through churches and schools and holding companies in the Cayman Islands. Men who shook hands with senators in framed photographs. Men who believed that bluster and money and the right last name were an effective shield against consequences. Sam was staring at his plate, pressing his lips together, trying not to cry over a piece of bread. Caroline was smiling, a smile that had nothing behind it. Garrick scrolled under the table. That was when the cold settled in. Not anger. Something older than anger. Recognition. After dinner, Spencer wanted brandy. Men like Spencer always need something in their hand when they are about to become more of themselves. Garrick poured it without being asked. Vivian talked to Caroline about tile and bathroom renovations as if the room had not just watched a child shrink at his own dinner table. Sam came back downstairs carrying the wooden chess box. He had brought it from his room. It had been my father's first. Then mine. Then his. Hand-carved in the 1950s. Worn smooth at all the right places. Worth nothing to someone who needs things to have receipts, and worth everything to anyone who understood what it meant to pass something between hands across generations. I had given it to Sam on his last birthday, and he had treated it the way he treated all things he loved. With care, with seriousness. With both hands, he crossed the living room and looked up at me. Grandpa, will you play? Before I could answer, Spencer said, chess at his age. He's been playing for 2 years. I said, he beat me last week. Spencer smiled at Garrick over his brandy glass. You probably let him win, he said. That laugh again. Not warm. Not proud. The kind of laugh designed to take a small, growing thing and press it flat. Sam's hands tightened on the box. His fingers slowed as he set up the pieces. He picked up a pawn, put it down, picked it up again. He knew exactly where a pawn belonged. He had known since he was 6. But Spencer's laughter had made him doubt himself. And watching a child doubt what he knows because a cruel person laughed is one of the hardest things I have ever had to sit through quietly. Then Spencer reached for the box. He picked up the king first, turned it over, frowned. Plastic wood, hand-carved. I said, it was my father's. He set the king down harder than necessary. Then picked up one of the knights. He was holding it carelessly, tilted. The way drunk men hold things they do not respect. I saw what was going to happen a half-second before it did. The knight slipped from his fingers, struck the edge of the coffee table, and the tip of the horse's mane snapped off. It hit the hardwood floor with a small sound that somehow filled the entire room. Sam made a sound. Not a word. Just a broken little intake of breath. Spencer looked at the damaged piece in his hand and rolled his eyes. Oh, for God's sake. It's wood. It was my father's, I said again. He glanced at me. Then your father had cheap taste. Edmund. The room went fully silent. Not a pause. A silence with edges. I did not look at Spencer. I looked at Caroline. I looked at my daughter because somewhere, very deep in me, even then, I was still expecting her to move. To stand up, to say something, Helen's voice in my daughter's mouth. sharp and final the way it got when a line had been crossed. I expected Caroline to walk to her son and place herself between him and the man who had just broken something irreplaceable and called it worthless. But Caroline looked at the floor. Her hands were folded too neatly in her lap. Her mouth opened once, then closed. She had already made the calculation. She had already weighed the cost of speaking and decided she would pay it later. Alone? After I was gone and the room had reset itself. And in that moment, I understood something I should have understood much sooner. This had happened before. Not with a chess piece. Not with those exact words. But in smaller, quieter forms. At dinners I had not attended. On mornings I had not witnessed. In the particular way, my daughter had learned to make herself easier to live around. She had been lowering her eyes for years. Then I looked at Garrick. He was sitting still, thumb frozen above his phone screen. For 1 second, I thought he was going to stand up. I thought he was going to do what a husband and father is supposed to do when the people he made promises to are being made small by someone else in their own home. He said, "Dad," he said. "Come on, that's enough." He said it lightly, the way a man speaks when he wants credit for objecting without paying anything for it. He did not move. He did not touch Caroline's arm. He did not go to Sam. Within 5 seconds, he went back to his phone, and I understood something clearly. Finally, without excuses. Caroline and Sam had been alone in that house for a very long time. I knelt beside my grandson because my knees still allowed it. Even if they reminded me of their objections every morning, Sam was holding the broken knight in both hands. The little carved piece of mane beside his shoe. He was trying very hard not to cry harder. And that effort hurt more than the tears would have. Because you do not try that hard to hold something back unless you have learned that falling apart in that room has consequences. I picked up the broken piece. "Sammy," I said, quietly, "can you do me a favor and get my coat from the front closet?" He nodded immediately. Grateful for a task. Grateful to leave without being told he was running. When he disappeared down the hallway, I stood slowly and looked around at all of them. Spencer, with that particular satisfaction certain men carry after cruelty. Vivian staring at her glass. Garrick with his phone held like a document that excused him from the room. Caroline in the doorway between fear and shame with both hands clasped in front of her. "I'm going to use the bathroom," I said, "and then I'll head home. Thank you for dinner." Caroline. Spencer smiled. "That's right," he said. "Run on home." I did not answer him. I walked down the hall, closed the bathroom door, and locked it. Then I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not touched in 3 years. Curtis Mlin. Everyone who knew him well called him Kurt. We had come up together at Treasury in 1994. Hartford first, then Washington, then back again. We had spent the better part of 12 years in the same unit, tracking money through structures that took years to untangle, testifying in proceedings that would never make the newspapers, writing reports that sat in sealed files while the men we had built cases against sat in their offices and assumed the world would always look the way they had arranged it. Kurt had retired a year after I did. But unlike me, he had not gone fully quiet. He still consulted. He still had access to conversations I was no longer part of. He answered on the third ring. "Eddie. Jesus. Everything okay?" I sat on the edge of the bathtub. The broken piece of my father's chest knight was still warm in my closed fist. "Kurt," I said, keeping my voice level and low. "I need you to run a name for me." A short silence. He knew me well enough to understand I would not ask this after 3 years of silence unless something had shifted. "Go," he said. "Spencer Holloway, real estate developer, Locust Valley, Long Island. Son named Garrick. Greenwich, Connecticut. Private equity firm in Stamford called Holloway Bridge Partners." I heard Kurt writing. Then nothing. That particular kind of quiet that settles when someone is reading something they were not expecting to find. Finally, he said, "Eddie, where are you right now?" "In the bathroom at my daughter's house." "Get out of there. Don't make a scene. Don't say anything to anyone. Drive home. I'll call you back." 23 minutes later, I was sitting in my truck in Garrick's driveway. Engine off. Hands on the wheel. The house glowed behind me through the windshield. Every window lit, as if nothing ugly lived inside it. My phone rang. Kurt's voice was different on the second call. Lower. "Careful. Spencer Holloway has been an active subject in a federal investigation for 14 months. He said, he is not the primary target. He is a facilitator. Shell entities. Structured purchases. Real estate used to move money through specific channels." Then he said a name. A name connected to the larger case. A name I recognized from a file I had helped build in 2011. For a moment, I just sat there with the phone against my ear and the broken chess piece in my coat pocket. Then I said, "How long until they move?" "That," Kurt said carefully, "depends on what new information arrives." I drove home with both hands locked on the wheel. The insults were still there. The way insults always are when they are spoken at a child in front of his family. The broken chess piece. The laughter. The words about my father. All of it still mattered. Still ached. But it had been joined by something larger now. Something that had been moving quietly long before I walked into that house. I was not the cause of what was coming for Spencer Holloway. I was the last door that opened. At 9:30, I called Caroline. She did not answer the first time. I waited 10 minutes and called again. Still nothing. So I left a message. Simple and clear. "Caroline, call me when Garrick is asleep. It's important." She called back at 11:15. Her voice had that particular flatness of someone speaking from a room where they were not sure of the walls. I kept it short. "Honey, I need you to trust me. Tomorrow morning, after Garrick leaves for work, take Sam and come to my house." A long pause. "Dad, what happened?" "I'll explain everything when you get here. Just come." Another pause. "Okay," she said. That was all. Caroline pulled into my driveway at 9:40 the next morning. She took the turn too fast and stopped too hard, which told me she had not slept. Sam climbed out of the back seat in pajama pants under his coat, hair pressed flat on one side. Caroline had woken him quietly, packed what mattered, and moved while the house was still silent. Through his half-open backpack, I could see the corner of the wooden chess box. Even after everything, he had brought it. I did not start with explanations. I made eggs and toast and sliced an apple the way Helen used to slice apples when Caroline was small, thin. Fanned out. A little overlapping. I let Sam eat in front of the television under one of Helen's old blankets. Then I sat across from my daughter at the kitchen table. Her face was pale. Her hands around the coffee mug were too still. "Dad," she whispered, "what is happening?" I took her hand and told her the truth. Not all of it. There are still names I will not say out loud, even now. But I told her enough. I told her that for most of my working life, my job had not been what I had described it as to her growing up. I had not been a desk man. I had been the kind of federal employee who followed money through structures that powerful people believed were invisible. I told her I had called a colleague the night before and given him a name. I told her that name had already been in a case file for over a year. And I told her that the call I made had not created something that did not exist. It had only moved a door that was already unlocked. Caroline listened without speaking. She did not ask me why I had never told her the full shape of my career. I think she already understood. There are things you keep quiet to protect the people closest to you. She had learned that lesson herself, though in a much harder way. "Dad," she said finally, "did you do this because of what happened last night?" I looked at my daughter for a long moment. "Yes," I said, "but I should have done something sooner." At 11:20 that morning, Kurt called. "They're moving now," he said. The house, Greenwich and Locust Valley both, and Garrick's office in Stamford. I looked across the table at Caroline. Her hands were still wrapped around her mug. She had not touched the coffee. "They're there now," I said. Her eyes closed. Not in relief. Not exactly. It was the look of someone who realizes that the structure they have been trying to hold together was already fracturing long before they saw the cracks. Not the relief of something ending. The exhaustion of finally knowing you were not wrong about what you felt. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Spencer Holloway was in custody. By 4, the story had reached the press. Men like Spencer always leave their names on buildings and boards and charity auction programs. Which means when their world collapses, it collapses in public. The newspapers printed his photograph alongside phrases like respected developer and prominent philanthropist, as if the good optics of a man's public life should somehow offset what he was doing in the private one. His lawyers tried to make it smaller. They always do. Overzealous prosecutors. Complicated transactions. Context that the headlines were not capturing. But the government had been building this case for 14 months. And they had documents. Wire records. And a cooperating witness who had been sitting quietly in the background while Spencer shook hands and gave speeches and made a child say please for bread at a dinner table. The trial began in May of the following year. Spencer looked diminished by then, in a way that was not just about suits or posture. He looked like a man who had spent months realizing that the rooms he used to own had all quietly changed their locks. He was convicted on 9 of 12 counts. Money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. The judge gave him 11 years in federal prison. No parole eligibility for 4 years. No brass buttons. No head of anyone's table. Garrick was not indicted. I want to be clear about that, because truth is not always as clean as we want it to be. The Bureau went through his books for months. They questioned him, tracked transfers, followed signatures, mapped what he knew and what he could credibly claim not to have known. In the end, the evidence was not sufficient to charge him. But a verdict is not the only form of consequence. Within 90 days, the major investors began withdrawing from Holloway Bridge Partners. Quietly at first, then all at once. Men who had laughed at Garrick's jokes stopped returning his calls. Lunches were rescheduled once, twice, and then never rescheduled again. Meetings vanished from calendars without explanation. His name, which had once opened doors in Stamford and Fairfield County and certain rooms in the city, became something no one wanted adjacent to their own. By the end of the year, the firm was closed. Garrick Holloway was 36 years old, unemployed, and learning for the first time what it felt like to walk into a room and already be dismissed. Garrick filed for divorce in June. Caroline filed her counterpetition the same week. I remember her sitting at my kitchen table with the papers in front of her, one hand around a mug of cold coffee, the other resting lightly on the wooden chess box Sam had set beside her before going to bed. She did not look victorious. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down feels unfamiliar. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something I had not seen in her face in years. Direction. The custody dispute lasted about 4 weeks before the lawyers on both sides began to understand the math. Garrick wanted to fight about schools and schedules and resources and stability. All the polished words men use when they want power to sound like concern. But his attorney, unlike Garrick, understood risk. There were things that could surface in a custody proceeding. Patterns. Witnesses. The particular way a child behaved after weekends in that house. The way Caroline had learned to answer questions with her eyes down. They agreed to joint legal custody with Caroline as the primary residential parent. Garrick got every other weekend. He used about half of them. Caroline and Sam moved into a rental house in Fairfield that fall. It was nothing like the Greenwich house, which is precisely why it was right. The floors creaked. The kitchen was narrow enough that you had to turn sideways to pass someone at the stove. The backyard was modest, just big enough for a small swing set and a patch of grass. But the first time Sam ran across that yard, I noticed something I had not seen from him in a long time. He did not look back over his shoulder. Caroline went back to work for a hospital foundation, a different one from her previous position. A fresh start with people who did not know the version of her she had been inside that Greenwich house. Some evenings I would drive over and find her barefoot in the kitchen, music playing low from a small speaker on the counter, spaghetti sauce simmering, Sam at the table working through homework problems with his pencil moving steadily. The chess box open on the corner of the table as if it lived there now. It was not perfect. The rebuilding of a life that has been compressed for years is never clean or quick. There were hard nights, mornings when Caroline woke up anxious in a house she was still learning to trust. Phone calls from Garrick's lawyer about scheduling and expenses that cost her 2 hours of worry every time. But the house felt safe. After everything they had been through, safe was a kind of miracle. The night took longer to repair than I expected. It was a clean break, structurally, but old carved wood remembers differently than new wood. The grain had its own memory of every hand that had touched it, and I wanted to do it right. I brought it to my workbench, laid it under my yellow work lamp, and sat there for a while before I opened the wood glue. My father had carved that set with a pocket knife, and the kind of patience that costs a man something real. He gave it to me when I was younger than Sam is now. For one foolish moment, sitting there, I hated myself for letting Spencer pick it up. Then I heard Helen's voice in the back of my mind, calm and clear, telling me to stop turning grief into blame. So I fixed it. Wood glue, a small clamp, a steady hand. I let it sit overnight, then sanded the edge just enough that the seam would not snag. You can still see it if you know exactly where to look. A hairline trace along the curve of the horse's mane. Sam noticed it the next time we played. He picked up the knight and turned it over in his fingers, then looked up at me. "It's still broken," he said. "No." I told him, "It's been through something. That's different." He held the piece carefully after that, more carefully than before, as if its damage had made it more worth protecting. 4 months after the indictment, Spencer's lawyer reached out to request a meeting. Caroline told me not to go. Kurt told me the same. Perhaps they were both right. But there are doors that, once they have been opened, need to be walked through before you can close them properly. We met at a small conference room at the federal courthouse in Brooklyn. Spencer arrived, looking diminished, in a way the newspapers had not quite captured. His suit was correct, but hung loose at the shoulder. His hair was still combed, but without its former authority. The watch was gone. There was nothing on his wrist but skin. For the first time, in every encounter I had with him, there was no room for Spencer to own. No head of a table. No brandy in his hand. No audience. Just a man across a table who had finally run out of places where other people were afraid of him. He stared at me for a long moment. "You did this," he said. I shook my head slowly. "You did this." "Spencer, I made a phone call. The people whose job it was to catch you did the catching." He leaned forward. "Who are you?" he said. "Who are you actually?" I almost gave him what he wanted. The job title, the division name, the history he had never bothered to imagine because he had mistaken silence for emptiness. I thought about it for a long second. Then I said, "I'm Sam's grandfather." His jaw tightened. Maybe that was the first moment he understood what he had actually done. He had not insulted a harmless old man at a dinner table. He had put his hands on something that belonged to the family of a man who had spent 31 years learning exactly how to dismantle people like him. Quietly, methodically, without giving them any warning at all. He looked away, then back. "If I hadn't broken the chess piece," he said, "if I hadn't said what I said about your father, would you still have made that call?" I thought about lying. I considered it seriously. Yes would have sounded cleaner, more righteous. But he had asked me an honest question. And after everything, I owed him an honest answer. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe not that night. Maybe never." He sat with that for a moment. But men like you, I added, always give people like me a reason eventually. You just picked which night it was going to be. Spencer Holloway had nothing left to say after that. A week ago, I was sitting at Caroline's kitchen table in Fairfield while Sam worked through his homework across from me. The radio was on, something low and instrumental that I could not have named. Caroline was at the stove, stirring sauce, humming half a note under her breath, the way she used to when she was a teenager and did not know anyone was paying attention. Sam looked up from his worksheet. "Grandpa," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What did you really do when you worked for the government?" Caroline went still with the wooden spoon in her hand. I looked at my grandson. He was old enough now to know when adults were carefully trimming the edges of a truth. And he was past the age of accepting a partial answer out of politeness. So I gave him the cleanest, honest thing I could. "I followed money," I said. "People who were powerful and dishonest would try to hide money in complicated ways so that no one could prove where it had come from or what it had been used for. My job was to find it, to trace it, to help build the kind of case that could hold up in a courtroom in front of a judge." Sam tapped his pencil eraser against the paper, thinking. "So," he said, slowly, "like Grandpa Spencer." Caroline stopped stirring the sauce. I was careful. Spencer was doing things he was not supposed to do. I said, things that hurt people. The people whose job it was to stop him had already been working on that for a long time. I just made a phone call that helped move things along. Sam looked at me with those serious eyes. "Did you catch him?" "No," I said. "I made the phone call. The people who do the catching did the catching." He seemed to like that distinction. Maybe because it was honest. Maybe because it did not make me sound like a hero. And he was old enough to be a little suspicious of heroes. He nodded once, then went back to his homework. About a minute later, without looking up, he said quietly, "That's a good job, Grandpa." Caroline turned her face toward the stove, and I saw her shoulders move. For the first time in a long time, those were not tears of fear. I want to be clear about something before I close this. I am not a man who believes in revenge for its own sake. I am not proud of pain, even pain delivered to people who earned it. For 31 years, I worked inside a system that was slow, imperfect, and sometimes deeply unfair. I watched guilty men walk free because evidence did not meet a legal threshold. I watched innocent people carry the weight of suspicion because they could not afford attorneys who understood the architecture of financial crime. The system I served was not clean. It was not always just, but I believed in it anyway. Because the alternative was every man deciding alone what consequences other people deserved. That belief did not change the night Spencer Holloway broke my father's chess piece and told my grandson to stop crying over toys. What changed was my threshold. I had been watching from a quiet distance for years while my daughter learned to lower her eyes. I had been carrying casseroles to dinners where I was treated like furniture. I had been telling myself that it was not my place, that Caroline was a grown woman, that I did not have the full picture, that things would find their own way toward balance. But the night I watched Sam try to hold back tears that he should never have been expected to hold back, the night Caroline looked at the floor instead of her son, the night Garrick sighed and picked up his phone, I understood that I had been confusing patience with passivity. I had been calling silence wisdom when it was actually just avoidance. I went to the bathroom. I made a phone call. I did not invent evidence. I did not fabricate a crime. I only told a man I trusted where to look. And what he found had been there for 14 months before I ever dialed his number. Quiet does not mean empty. Quiet watches the way a child walks up the stairs in his own home. Quiet notices the moment a daughter laughs at a joke that hurt her because she has already learned that the cost of not laughing is higher. Quiet hears every correction, every interruption, every eye roll at a dinner table, and files it away, not in bitterness but in understanding. Spencer Holloway saw a quiet old man with a government pension and a paid-off house and a cracked taillight and decided that was the whole picture. He was not the first powerful man to make that mistake around me. He was simply the one who chose the wrong night to break something that mattered. And sometimes, one phone call is all it takes to move the full weight of a truth that has been building for years. If this story stayed with you, I want to ask you something honestly. Would you have stayed quiet as long as I did? Or would you have moved sooner? And if you have ever watched someone you love slowly disappear inside a relationship that was slowly erasing them, what did you do about it? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. If you believe that real justice is often quiet and slow and arrived at by people no one thought to watch, subscribe. There are more stories like this one. More people who waited, watched, and finally delivered something that lasted